We have that wonderful session just after lunch, which means that we're going to be coming to the audience quite early in our session, and you're going to have to still be awake. Now, to help me ensure that that is the case, we have a wonderful panel of really talented and experienced speakers. And the topic we're going to explore is resilience. And before we get into it with our speakers, I'd just like to poll the audience. Who here would consider the UK economy to be resilient? Show of hands, yes?
I think you have to say yes.
All right. Who thinks it is not resilient? That's okay, all right. How about UK government? Yes for resilient? 3, okay. How about yourselves as British people? Are you resilient? Okay, so we are individually resilient, but collectively not so much. I won't introduce the speakers with their detailed bios, but we have Catherine Little, Cat Little, with us today from HM Treasury, though I think I'm allowed to disclose that in just a couple of weeks, in 1 week, you will take up the role as the Civil Service Chief Operating Officer and Permanent Secretary to the Cabinet Office.
Which means she's basically in charge of government resilience. So she can't say it's not resilient yet.
It's exactly why I'm here, to learn as much as I can from you.
We have Dr. Gillian Tett, who you may have known from the Financial Times, but we are very pleased to have her here in Cambridge as Provost of King's College. And we have Dr. Anna Valero from the London School of Economics, who is a professor in innovation and policy, and it's great to have you with us. So, Anna, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. What, in your mind, does resilience mean, and what is currently being done to future-proof the UK?
Thank you very much, Matthew. And just for the record, I'm not a professor. I would love to be, of course, if anyone from LSE is listening.
Soon. Soon.
But it was really interesting to see those shows of hands and how many of us feel on a personal level that we have more resilience, perhaps, than some of the structures around us. I think that's something we should also learn some positive lessons from the recent shocks we've been through as society. So what does resilience mean? I thought a good starting point, since we're in Cambridge, is to look in the Cambridge Dictionary. And it's defined as the quality of being able to return quickly to a previous good condition after problems. So that's quite a broad definition. That's the business English one. I would have thought like a consistent but perhaps slightly broader definition, which I think would cover a lot of the things we want to talk about here today, would include also the ability of individuals or groups to adjust to sources of change that aren't necessarily a problem overall. They might be a positive thing for society, but they're likely to cause some problems for specific groups or specific people. So, for example, we might think about technological change there as one such trend. So broadly, when we think about how to achieve resilience, it involves some sort of investment. So it might be investment in capabilities or skills that make adjustment easier for individuals, organizations, and places. It might be in infrastructure or technologies, which might be tangible or intangible, that are particularly important for addressing certain types of shock or change. So there we might think net zero, for example, is a key instance of that. And then resilience is also going to mean investment in stable, lasting, and coordinated institutions. These need to be well-resourced in people, in data, we heard about this in the last session, in methods, methodologies. They need to be coordinated with each other as part of a systemic kind of approach, particularly because there's so much overlap when we're talking about resilience. And therefore, these institutions that can enable individuals, groups, and economies not only to respond to shocks and sources of change, but also to preempt them, given the fact we're in very uncertain times, but try to preempt different scenarios and respond to that significant uncertainty. So what are some more tangible examples of what resilience means for the UK? Well, we know there's a set of issues around climate change adaptation. So this is where we have a global challenge that is impacting on us in this country, and we need to make investments in adaptation so that adverse impacts of kind of acute shocks, such as extreme weather events, or more slow-burning shocks, such as rising sea levels, can be minimized. Then there's the net zero transition. So this is something that we need to do globally for the resilience of humanity and the planet. But I would argue that net zero investments also provide lots of resilience benefits here in the UK as well. You know, in the UK, it's about 2% of global emissions. We can obviously contribute to the global picture, but we need other countries with much bigger emissions to make significant cuts. But these resilience benefits from the net zero transition here in the UK are really important, and we've just seen them. So take energy security in face of an energy crisis. Net zero investments in energy efficiency and renewables, they will make us more resilient to those. And the co-benefits such as cleaner air and improved health for our people going into the next pandemic or public health crisis. Then there's benefiting from technological change, digital technologies such as AI. I think there was a lot of discussion this morning on this. Resilience for the UK is for people to be able to adjust to that, for firms to be able to adjust to that, for us to be able to lead and understand in the development of the technologies, but also be able to shape diffusion in a safe and inclusive way. Pandemics, another key example we've seen recently, sadly, but we need to go into future pandemics in a situation with adequately funded public services and infrastructure, capabilities in key supply chains, acknowledging the uncertainty there, but having some sort of agility, perhaps. Strong research capacity and expertise in the development of key medicines and vaccines and their deployment. There's a whole set of things around geopolitical risks, clearly where we need to be resilient. And I would argue that just achieving broad-based productivity growth is fundamental to our resilience as a nation. And that is enabled by investments in infrastructure, innovation, and skills. If you can do that, you drive improvements in living standards. People going into shocks will have more of a cushion to fall back on through savings. We have a really low savings rate here in the UK compared to other countries. And through that productivity growth, we'll actually be able to afford all the other investments and policy priorities that we're kind of discussing when we're talking about all these sources of change and shocks. So I realise I should finish these opening comments, but there's a lot of activity clearly across government, across industry, across universities, the third sector, to build resilience across all of those areas. And recently there have been various policy announcements, initiatives, trying to boost investment in things that matter for the long term, whether it's things like planning reforms, channeling pensions, finance into productive UK assets. But it's clear that there are significant gaps. We've underinvested for a long time. You can see the impacts of that underinvestment in our crumbling infrastructure in some places and fundamentally in our productivity record. So there really is a need for a holistic and lasting coordinated approach to these challenges. Obviously, that's not easy. We have lots of strong institutions, lots of independent institutions, lots of expertise in this country. But it's clear that there's so much interrelatedness, there could be more role for better coordination and system-wide approach. And we're in fiscally constrained times, so that's particularly difficult. So I just want to finish on a specific proposal here, which is more on the growth side, but really so many elements of policy interact with growth in kind of both directions. And this is to bring back something like the Industrial Strategy Council that we heard about in the previous session. This was something that Greg Clark introduced. It was disbanded. Labour are now currently saying they would bring it back on a statutory footing. So a proposal that I've developed with colleagues, including Bart Van Ark at Manchester, is for an independent statutory body on growth and productivity, something like the Climate Change Committee, but focused on growth. And this will provide a location for long-term expertise, analysis, monitoring government policies, holding government to account on its kind of record when it comes to what policies look like for the long-term resilience and productivity outlook for the country.
Brilliant, thank you. So lots going on, some to come, perhaps. I'm going to turn to you now, Gillian, if that's okay. We've seen there's lots of activity in government and business and industry. What do you think are the challenges and opportunities in resilience that these might be?
Well, Anna just gave you a wonderful definition of what resilience is. Hands up, anyone in the room who knows where the roots of the word resilience actually comes from. None of you are, like half a hand going up or whatever. Okay,
Yeah,
right,
great
tell us.
phone.
All right, you have a head start.
Silo is a verb to jump, ray means back. Jump back.
Fantastic, thank you. It does, and the thing I love, woo, that's one way to make sure everyone's awake. What I love is the jumping back, the salire, is actually the same root as somersault. So there's your little bit of trivia for the day, that resilience is linked to somersaulting linguistically in the root. What I want to do is just float a quick idea about how to look at resilience on a national level. Because as a journalist, I was looking a lot at the corporate sector during COVID and trying to work out why some companies were a lot more resilient than others. And I think what we saw back then has a lot of relevance for how we look at government processes around resilience today as well. And very roughly speaking, when I was looking from a New York perch at why some companies were so much more resilient in the COVID shock than others, I came to the conclusion there were basically 4 I words that you had to think about: information, imagination, integration, and individual empowerment. And what I mean by that is this. The information part comes from the fact that if you were a company during COVID that wanted to work out how to survive a shock to the system, you needed to know what was actually happening at the root level before you could actually plan or even have a sense of whether you were resilient or not. Sounds really obvious, but one thing that emerged during COVID was that companies had radically different levels of knowledge about their supply chains. And the ones that had been involved in efforts to make their supply chains ESG compliant, i.e. the ones that were tracking environmental and social risks, had massive more data about the granular developments in their supply chains than the ones which were not. And they were far more resilient because they actually knew what was happening. So 1, you need to have good information, and that applies to countries as well as companies. Secondly, you need to have imagination. You need to try and imagine what you don't have information about and how the future could actually be different from the very recent past. And I can't stress that strongly enough because so many of the models in economics and risk management that companies and countries use are based on the assumption that the future will look like the very recent past. That sense of data, that approach to data management, is driving a lot of our AI programs today as well. So you have to have human imagination to see how it could be different and prepare for it together with the information about what's actually happening right now. Thirdly, you need integration, or to use another word, you need silo busting. Because one of the things, and this is the second to last book I wrote about, was called The Silo Effect. One of the truths of the corporate world is that silos exist in almost every organization, and they cause bright people to do really, really stupid things. And most of the time, when new risks are emerging, they cut across silos. Risks tend to occur at the edge of silos. And people in institutions that are trapped into silos, generally speaking, cannot cope with new emerging risks if they stay in their silos, both structurally and mentally. People with tunnel vision, which is most of us most of the time, cannot see new risks or have any hope of actually tackling them. So integration is the third I. And the fourth I, because I know I've only got 5 minutes, is individual empowerment. And by that I mean that something that's very clear in a company and in a government is that if you're trying to manage risks in a totally top-down way, if you have someone at the top who's giving orders and an organization is not empowered to either see risks or tackle them just through a top-down process, it has zero chance of effectively managing risks at all. You need to have individual empowerment in terms of actually gathering information about what's happening and bringing it back to the center to tell people about new risks. And you also need individual empowerment to have the imagination to find flexible and effective ways to respond. Often in companies, it's the people at the grassroots actually managing supply chains who are the most effective and clever at seeing ways to cope when there are supply chain shocks. So I personally think those 4 principles can be applied as much to a government as a company. This doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what this translates to in policy terms. You just heard about that from Anna. But I think keeping those 4 I's in mind, the fact you need information, imagination, integration, and individual empowerment in a process way, I think is a secret to actually having governments become a lot more resilient in the way they actually go forward with public policy processes. And on that note, Kat can tell you exactly what she's going to do once she's in office to put it into practice. I just observe. She actually has to do things.
I loved your comment on silo busting, but I would just like to point out that we at the Bennett are not siloed. If you were here this morning, you learned from Mike that we work with every department across the university and beyond. Kat, what is the government's role to play here?
Right, well, before I answer that question, I should probably just first say a huge thank you to the Bennett Institute. I think it's wonderful that we're having...
Yeah, we should have a round of applause for
We
that,
really
actually,
should.
'cause, you
It's
know,
great that we're having this
exactly.
conversation. And it's especially great as I'm in handover, ready to take on my role and actually deliver all of this from next week. So a lot of what I'm going to say is going to build very much on what both Gillian and Anna have said, and I very strongly agree with a lot of what's been said already. So what is government's role? Well, very simply, I mean, we're here to provide the strategy, we're here to make sure that there's a coherent sum of the parts, and that the state as a whole is resilient. And I think an important role in particular that we've got is to make sure that we have the conditions to ensure that others can succeed as well as the state nationally. So you probably saw that we published the National Framework for Resilience in December 22, and there has been a huge amount of work since implementing and enhancing the approach to resilience. And as you said right at the start, there's still a lot more that we need to do. And I think there's a really important principle in that framework, which is the whole society approach. It is absolutely critical that what we are doing, and I think this very much plays to your point about empowerment and transparency in particular, is making sure that not just the government, but everyone who has an important contribution to make towards resilience is able to effectively take part and contribute. So 4 key things from me as well. Firstly, it's all very well having information, but I think it's also really important that we have transparency and access to information. So last year in August, we published the most comprehensive national resilience risk register, and it set out the 89 most serious risks that the country is facing, very, very transparently, what we're doing about it, what you can expect for the government to be coordinating. So that's one example. We've also recently launched the emergency alert system, and we're currently working on a new resilience website, which is about just making sure there is clear, up-to-date, sensible information for everyone to access about what the government is doing. The second big area is about skills. So one thing that we really, really learned from especially the pandemic, but through years of working through lots of resilience work and crises responses, is that you've got to really professionalise the way in which you approach resilience, and particularly there's a core role for government in making sure that we have a cadre of people who've got appropriate training and are resilient themselves in the way in which we support the government, the state, and respond in times of critical crisis. So we're looking to establish a National Resilience Academy next year, and already our wonderful COBRA team in the Cabinet Office do lots and lots of training throughout government. So there's lots of dedicated training, depending on what level you are, what your role is, to make sure that everyone who has a role to play has the skills and professional support to do their role. We've talked a lot about long-term resources and investment, but only the state can take some of the biggest decisions about where you ultimately invest for the long term of the resilience. And one thing I'd be quite keen to come back to, Anna, is your point about making sure that resilience is adequately funded. I really agree, but there are always trade-offs between overall economic resilience and adequately funding resilience for the long term. And I suppose in my current role, that is one of the very wicked trade-offs that I've been involved in. And I think it's easier said than actually done, given the current state of the public finances. But we are investing for the long term. I was very pleased that at least we had a multi-year SR in 2021. That's a spending review. In an ideal world, we would have longer SRs, but of course that's for the government of the day to consider, and they have to take into account all sorts of things. Testing resilience is a really critical thing. So we've got our national exercising programme where we are testing how we would actually respond to all of these risks and evaluating how well we do at it. And that's really, really important, you know, our humility to learn from these exercises and to set out what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, is obviously very, very important. So they'd be my 4 key things that I think government especially has to focus on. One other thing that I'm particularly fascinated in at the moment is systems leadership. And I really agree with your point, Gillian. Like everything we do in government, in fact, everything we all do as humans, as part of a very complex system of networks, and especially in government, we need to lead across barriers and borders, and that is in itself quite a unique challenge and needs quite a lot of resilience. So an interesting subject that I hope to do more on.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Anna, would you like to follow up? There's a challenge.
Yeah,
We
so
need to invest in everything, but there are trade-offs.
So actually, if I'd have had a bit longer, I'd even noted down the word trade-offs. I think it's really important to be honest about trade-offs, to try and quantify them to our best abilities, and then navigate through them. This is actually one of the key things that came out of the Economy 2030 inquiry, which was a big piece of work we did with Resolution Foundation, funded by Nuffield, where it was what's a new economic strategy for the UK. And a good economic strategy for a more prosperous, more fair economy also has to be clear about where there are trade-offs. We have many different objectives. Sometimes there are synergies for those objectives, and they tend to be synergies, I think, across most of the objectives we have. Stronger growth, sustainability, and inclusiveness. There are synergies over the longer run, but there can be trade-offs over the shorter run. So I think actually this productivity growth institution, we didn't come up with a name, that could be a place for actually trying to do that kind of analysis. So interacting, for example, with the CCC to say, okay, we're doing all this work and investment for net zero. Where are there actual synergies where this could be actually beneficial for growth on different timeframes because of resilience to an energy crisis, because we develop supply chains here, perhaps growth opportunities, other benefits. But where are there trade-offs, particular firms or sectors, for example, if they're investing in a net zero solution, maybe they're not investing in expanding, which in that given year might have seen stronger growth. So I think actually trade-offs across all these areas. Take regional growth versus national growth. We want synergies, we don't want displacement. But there's always going to be some level of displacement when you're doing a place-based policy. But how can we be honest about those things?
Excellent. Thank you very much. In just a moment, we're going to come to the audience. I told you we tried to get to you early in the session. So there's going to be microphones roving around, so think about your questions. As you're doing that, I just want one more from you, Gillian. We've spoken a bit about businesses, and we've spoken a bit about government, but clearly there's another really important component of our civil society, it's the media. And I'm interested in what you think about how the media either supports or undermines resilience here in the UK.
Wow. Well, if there's one thing that unites almost all politicians in this very polarized time, it's that if in doubt, blame the media. So I can be central target number 1 right now. I think the media plays an interesting role right now in 2 ways. Firstly, it can be a very good early warning signal about where there are problems and emerging risks developing. But it can also play a very negative role by essentially not recognizing the need for a grown-up debate around trade-offs, not being particularly integrated in its own reporting, and also focusing far too much on finger-pointing and blaming and not enough on problem-solving. And, you know, I'm not saying that it's not the media's role to expose stupid behavior, because it absolutely is the media's role to expose stupid behavior, and that's part of the early warning system, if you like, that, you know, should be effective. So when governments try to stop media groups from exposing stupid behavior, or when companies do, they're actually missing a trick there. You know, the media should be exposing risks that are emerging. But if I have one thing I'd like to say as someone who's lived for many years in America, but obviously grew up in the UK and is now back in Cambridge, is that, you know, people sometimes talk about, you know, there are many, many, many things that are terribly wrong with America today. I could give you a long list, starting and ending with Donald Trump. But there are also some good things, and one of them is, apart from the usual kind of can-do spirit and blah, blah, blah that people talk about in America, which is very exciting, is that in many parts of America there is a focus on problem solving. rather than just whinging. And I do think that one of the things that sadly strikes me having come back to the UK is how much focus there is on whinging and blaming and finger-pointing rather than problem-solving and treating a problem as a chance to be entrepreneurial and find a solution rather than treating a problem as someone else's fault that you're going to yell about. And, it sounds a bit trite, but I do think that trying to create that culture shift towards more emphasis on problem solving rather than whinging or blaming is part of being more resilient looking forward, both on an individual level and on a national level. And I would say, as someone who's still writing columns for the FT, is something that the media needs to celebrate rather than just stoking up a culture of blaming and whinging.
Completely agree. Kat, you
I
want
was
to
just
come in?
very keen to come in on that because I could not agree more.
I can see you were basically nodding. I say, if in doubt, blame the media.
Yeah, or the civil service. I
think media comes first.
Yeah, we can debate that. I've spent quite a bit of time this week at the Global Government Forum talking about innovation, and I really passionately believe that quite often the biggest problems that we're facing are not the first time that we face problems, but we are brilliant at setting out the problem statement. And, I talk to my own teams in government about, okay, so how do we take the well-validated problem statement and really innovate to think about what the art of the possible is in solving those problems? And so in government, we've been talking a lot about how we create new skills, space for innovation, space for creativity, so that we're not just focusing on going over and over the same old problems without different ways of thinking about solutions. So I think innovation plays a really, really key part of that. And it's easy to say, but actually a very complex set of leadership, cultural things in government that we've got to do to make sure that innovation and solutioneering is actually at the heart of how we train and look after people in the civil service in particular.
Yeah, one thing I was going to add, and it sounds a bit promotional, I don't mean it this way, is one of the things that attracted me to King's is the fact that it has an e-lab, an entrepreneurship lab, which was created 3 or 4 years ago, as very much at the time it was quite an innovation within Cambridge, because when I was at Cambridge 30 years ago, no one was talking about e-labs or entrepreneurship labs. But one of the things that I keep trying to say to people is it's actually not about entrepreneurship in the sense of trying to teach people to become like Elon Musk, God forbid. It's more about trying to propagate a culture of entrepreneurial thinking. And entrepreneurial thinking can be found as much in medicine or law or tech or government as in the private sector. And instilling that entrepreneurial thinking, which is really about seeing, here is a problem, let's treat that as an opportunity to find a solution, that is, I think, is at the core of what, frankly, the university needs, most of us need in our own lives, but frankly, the UK needs very badly right now to really reboot itself, or to rebound and to be like on a trampoline and doing its somersault, which is resilience.
I have to let Anna come back in, but then we're coming straight to you guys for questions.
I just wanted to emphasize those points and then think, what does it actually mean in terms of how do we achieve that creativity, that problem-solving culture? And I think there's a role for organizations themselves thinking about their own specific challenges and how to train people. We've seen that on-the-job training has been in decline, and it's particularly low for those at lower skill levels in the UK, so that's a problem with policy initiatives that could address it. But then there's the broader, how do we teach kids? How do we teach young people? Are we valuing creative subjects which teach some of that more creative thinking? Are soft skills being provided consistently across society? Some of the soft skills you get through extracurricular activities. So I think there are implications for also our education system as well as organizations where we know there are gaps.
It's brilliant. We've touched on everything. We've even got into early childhood education. That's lovely. For those of you who maybe haven't followed it yet, it sometimes seems to me as though the entrepreneurship lab at King's has a college attached to it, rather than the other way around.
That's not how we see it.
There is so much brilliant activity going on there. I really do encourage you to follow it.
Yeah, we're open to everyone in any colleges, by the way. Any of you can come along to these events, so please do.
So we have some microphones. There's going to be a question down here with Ben, and a question here, the young lady in white.
Ben Martin from the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University. First of all, I want to thank the three panellists for an excellent introduction to the topic of resilience. But I want to take up one thing that Catherine mentioned about the risk register. The risk register was one of the last acts of Sir David King. It was first published in 2008, identified risks that face Britain, classified them in terms of likelihood and likely impact. Top right-hand corner, an international or global pandemic. Question, why were we not better prepared? Will we be better prepared next time? And I'd like to pick up a comment from the earlier session about there's a lot of talking, a lot of analysis going on, but we're not then very good at following up. Can we be better prepared next time?
Brilliant. Excellent question, so that'll come to you. I'm going to take one more here.
Hi, Natalie Doyle from the Centre of Institute of Sustainability. Sorry, nervous getting on the mic in front of a crowd. My question is, we've had a lot of I words thrown around in that conversation, and I guess as most of the people in this room are policy people, it'd be interesting to know what you think the next I is as implementation, and how we can implement, take example of supply chains to become more sustainable and resilient.
I think we'll take these two and run with it. So, Kat?
Well, shall I take Ben's first question? Yeah. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we've been doing risk registers on national level for a very long time. I'd like to think that we've evolved and made them better over time. Now, obviously, we've got the COVID inquiry at the moment, and that question of what was the government doing? How did we respond? Their Module 1 findings will be out in due course, so I won't preempt all of that, but the very simple answer is yes. And there is a lot that we've learned, and there's a lot that we need to do differently. But obviously I can't comment much more, given this is going to be subject to quite a lot of government response in the coming months.
And on implementation?
I'd like to say very quickly, going back to the tangible examples I saw during COVID of companies with implementation. What happened when the supply chain crunch happened to many companies was that essentially in the decade or two before COVID, almost every company out there had faced enormous pressure to streamline its supply chain in the most efficient, cost-effective and efficient way, which almost invariably meant that they basically all went through one or two single nodes or hubs to try and streamline things and make everything a lot more efficient. And in their own individual silos, what each of them had done was very rational, but they hadn't looked across the entire system and realized that they were all doing exactly the same thing, which meant that although they all thought that they were being rational individually, when you added them up collectively, what they were doing was kind of insane. And so when you had this massive disruption in supply chains, what really sorted out the sheep from the goats was, as I say, first of all, corporate boards that had the information about the degree to which goods were passing through a couple of narrow bottlenecks were immediately in a better position than those who didn't. The companies which had already had the imagination to think about what would happen if those bottlenecks went wrong were again also ahead of the curve, because some companies quickly managed to switch away from those bottlenecks which were broken and actually tap into other suppliers, others didn't. Then you had the problem of actually using all of your human talent and skills to try and think of new solutions to the problem of, say, this particular bottleneck being broken. And that often involved tapping into information from all kinds of different sources. So different departments sometimes would know things which other departments didn't in terms of finding solutions to problems. And often the suppliers working back down the supply chain would have better insights. And as I said earlier, the companies which have been doing ESG strategies already had to go back through the different layers of their supply chain to get to know what was happening on a granular basis and try to reimagine that quite significantly. And then you had to kind of, empower these employees to actually put new strategies into place. So when it comes to implementation, which by the way, I think is a third brilliant I, it really requires an ability to have lateral thinking, not tunnel thinking, and to actually give people the ability to come up with their own ideas and solutions about how to actually find problem-solving mechanisms in practice.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of more. We've got one right here, and then one from the classics professor, and then one in the very back. this section of the room, I need more hands next time.
Gavin Oldham. Universal monopoly provision of a free at the point of use service has lost all its resilience. At the moment, the NHS has soaring percentage of public expenditure and is desperately inefficient. We have a situation where Labour are grounded in time-expired socialism, but Conservatives are terrified to lose votes from old people. Here's my question coming up. By mandating health insurance to wealthy old folk, which they could do. I wonder if you could see any way to get out of this Mexican standoff.
I think that's one for Kat.
We've got, from the classics professor, yes?
Hi, I'm Arlene Holmes-Henderson, Professor of Classics and Public Policy at Durham University. My question is about how we build resilience in the people who make the decisions. So I'm thinking civil servants and also ministers. My perception is that decisions are often data-driven and based on short-term reactive thinking. And my provocation to the panelists is, should we have fewer advisors from STEM subjects and more advisors from arts and humanities subjects? Should we think less about the how and more about the why? Might that make us more resilient?
Wonderful. And there's one more question, the gentleman in the back.
Hello, my name is William Awomoyi. I'm an entrepreneur and undergrad at Cambridge here. I had a quick question for Gillian based on her framework. She talked about the 4 I's, which sort of sounded like a deductive framework to me. And she sort of spoke about countering the prevailing sort of means of risk management and AI models, which sort of use like an inductive mode of inference. And of course, a key characteristic of like an inductive mode of inference is the fact that you can't actually be certain of the truth. So my question then is, do we need to use more deductive modes of inference in problem solving? And perhaps on that note, in terms of the information and the data that we're collecting, do we need to start collecting more qualitative data instead of quantitative data?
Okay, wonderful. So we've got the NHS, we've got arts and humanities advisors rather than STEM advisors, and we've got data quality over quantity. Who wants to jump in?
Shall I take health spending resilience?
Sure.
In the best way that I can. Look, it's a really critical question. So we know that the demand for health services and the demographics of our country are going to consume more and more of the state's finite resources. And it is a question which governments will have to face for many years to come. This is not a quick fix. But I suppose the one thing I would point to is going back to actually something Anna said, the need to drive productivity and growth across the whole of the economy is part of the solution. And you will have all seen at the spring budget quite a significant investment, despite us being out of the normal cycle for long-term spending and a long-term commitment to drive investment in productivity in the NHS. That is just the start. It doesn't just need money, it needs skills, it needs capacity, it needs investment in the estate. There are lots of things that help to drive it, but I think that is part of the answer. And clearly, you know, this is going to be one of the big policy questions that I think future governments are going to have to grapple with and to tackle head on.
Thank you.
Humanities? Okay, all right. And the issue of humanities and ways of looking at the world, I am completely biased because I trained as a cultural anthropologist before I became a journalist and went into writing about finance and economics. Writing about finance and economics, I was constantly faced with people who said, why the hell have you got a degree in anthropology instead of, you know, economics or astrophysics or something quantitative? And I'd say, actually, I think that in order to make sense of data, you need to actually have a social and cultural framework and context to understand it in. Or the tagline that I used a lot in my last book is that, you know, artificial intelligence only really works effectively for society when it's combined with anthropology intelligence. And when you put those two things together, you get the right type of AI, which is augmented intelligence, where essentially AI tools are used as a tool for human thinking, not a replacement. And, I've seen that time and again, that actually combining qualitative and quantitative, or combining a training in classics, humanities with data science is absolutely critical. And to give a tiny example of that, during the financial crisis, it was very telling that the Bank of England official who had the keenest awareness of what was going wrong in the financial system at the grassroots was Paul Tucker, who was running the financial risk section at the time. And he often attributed to the fact that his training had actually not been in economics or modelling or astrophysics, but he was actually trained initially in philosophy and classics as well. And he said the real value of that was teaching him that there's a diversity of epistemological approaches to the world. There's more than one way to just look at the world. And having that flexibility of your brain, that plasticity of your thought process, is critical for seeing risks. And so the last thing I'll leave on is that it really concerns me that the British educational system channels people into educational silos so early. I wish we had more of a liberal arts education approach to life. I wish we had the ability to switch between subjects and get that broad-based approach. But the more that we create silos within education, the harder it will be to get that kind of plasticity of brain, which is needed.
I personally benefited greatly from the North American view, where you can start with a liberal arts intro, because I was supposed to be a biochemical engineer, according to my father.
Yeah, no, in the great one of, there are many things wrong with American higher education, many things wrong. But one of the good things is ability to start in one subject and jump between others and switch around and just get that broad-based view early on.
Can I answer a few thoughts across all of those questions, actually? I mean, actually, some of my initial remarks were emphasizing the importance of creativity and other disciplines. However, while acknowledging that and the importance of qualitative data, which is fundamentally important, and cross-disciplinary thinking and multidisciplinary thinking, there is really a value in quantitative data. Without quantitative data, how can you really understand change over time? How can you really make comparisons? How can you actually understand whether different policies work in a robust way? So that's the defense of more the economics and the quantitative types of analysis. And really, data was so important. So linking to some of the questions before, what did we learn from the pandemic? Well, we learned things we could have done better, but we also learned some pretty encouraging lessons, I think, which is when there's a massive urgent crisis that needs to be dealt with, when everyone's incentives to deal with the crisis are aligned, you can actually achieve a lot very quickly. Yes, there were mistakes made, but that's the kind of urgency we should be applying to the climate crisis, globally and within countries. And it's actually the kind of urgency we should be applying to our growth crisis, because we've had 15 years of stagnation in productivity, and that is related to the stagnation in real wages. People's living standards are suffering, and then people went into these shocks. That's not resilient. So I think we can take positive lessons from that and actually use data analysis, better data sharing, better data linking to also make our responses more agile as crises happen.
Just one very quick thought on that. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about our ability to get things done in a crisis is you've got explicit permission to take more risk. And one of the things that we've been kind of looking at in the civil service especially is how do you create the conditions where risk-taking and therefore the higher chance of failure is more acceptable when you're using public money and you're obviously dealing with very, very precious public services. And I think that's quite it's a subject we come back to quite a lot. But because we have gone through a period of multiple crises, it's a very rich learning environment for us to think about what was it outside of the fact that we had a crisis that allowed us to do that, and how do you replicate it in kind of non-crisis business as usual.
I mean, it's very hard to do that unless you have basically a civil service that is both highly integrated and well run and also respected in society, and which actually has a cultural freedom to take risks. I mean, there are many countries like that. I mean, Singapore is one of the few where you actually have civil servants who are paid a lot, highly respected, and sufficiently holistic in their policy making to actually be able to think about taking risks. But most countries can't.
We've got some questions from online, and one of them is about the role of technology in enhancing our resilience and future-proofing the economy? And in particular, do we think that AI is going to improve our ability to predict the challenges and then our ability to respond to them? And the other question that's come close to my heart, so thank you, the online audience. One of the big challenges for responding to risks like climate change is that a lot of the benefits accrue to future generations, but the costs are going to be faced by the current population. How do we deal with investing in resilience for the long term when we have so many short-term challenges here and today?
Could I take that second question?
Go for it.
I'll try and be brief because it's one of my specialist subjects. So I actually think, so people assume that government will never take high investment decisions where the benefits accrue over a very long period of time, because obviously we tend to be operating over short-term fiscal rule period or shorter fiscal rule periods. I think that is obviously something that, particularly in my current role in the Treasury, we are constantly trying to break down some of the perceptions about that and to make sure that obviously when we advise, we are setting out the very, very long-term benefits, not just the financial and economic benefits. Really interesting recent example is investment in childcare, where we are basically, the Treasury is basically saying we think it is such an important thing for us to be investing in. Yes, there will be benefits accrued. We probably won't see them for many, many generations. Skills is another one. Actually, we have done a huge amount in recent times, and I think sometimes we don't quite recognise that is the thought process that is happening, and certainly that's what I've observed, is us trying to do more investment up front in prevention policy, and despite all of my chartered accountancy instincts, I'm sort of, stopping us from forcing the kind of desire to count the benefits and to really focus on both the qualitative and economic benefits as well.
Very good. And Anna, can I?
So I mean, when the question that you set out is really the question that we ask with any investment decision, because any investment decision is something you're paying for now, but you won't necessarily feel the benefits until later. So an individual's decision to do a master's, for example, the benefits presumably will pay off in higher wages over time, but there's a cost now. So I think, we know that the UK has been underinvesting when we take public sector gross fixed capital formation as a share of GDP compared to other countries. So we know that we need to do more on that anyway from a growth perspective, then add in all the net zero and other things that we face, defence budgets, etc. The question then is, how can we have the right frameworks to support that? There's a lot of discussion these days about our fiscal rules, and I think that was discussed in a previous session. But currently, there's very much focus on this 5-year period. And yes, there are lots of policy decisions where we're seeing that actually there is a lot of appreciation of longer-term outcomes. Take planning reforms, pension reforms, the full expensing of capital investment being made permanent. All of those things were not necessarily scored in a 5-year period. But can we amend those fiscal rules, given that they're amended quite often? I think there's quite a lot of consensus amongst lots of people, including the Institute for Government, that there's room for reforming our fiscal frameworks. Fiscal rules are very important, but do we have the ideal set of fiscal rules for our economy if we actually want to change things fundamentally on the supply side? Probably not.
Can I say something about the AI issue?
Please.
Yeah. I often think that AI is a bit like economic models or balance sheets, in that they are fantastic compasses for telling you roughly where you should be going. And AI is offers the potential to create much better types of economic models and balance sheets, looking at roughly where you're going as a compass and hoovering up much more data than before to see future risks. But the point about a compass is that if you carry a compass and walk through a dark wood at night and you only stare down at the compass all the time, even if your compass is telling you roughly where to go, you're probably going to walk into a tree or trip over a tree root. You have to basically sometimes lift your eyes up from the compass, look around, get a bit of lateral vision, and see the context in which your compass is operating. And AI tools are amazingly valuable, but they still need to be used with a shred of human brain to look at what they might be missing, or just to provide some simple checks and balances. I mean, there's a reason why people talk about checks and balances being useful in government. is because you need different perspectives. And so it comes back to my point that the best type of AI is augmented intelligence, that's artificial intelligence and anthropology intelligence, trying to blend the two together to use the tools we have more intelligently.
Thank you. I think we have time for another round of questions. And then I am going to come back to you as the panel for closing remarks, so you're on notice. And wonderful, the middle of the room has woken. Excellent. So we have a question down here in the very front. I'm going to make Tola run as far as I can.
Okay, can I just ask what's sort of the role in our thinking for thinking more about recovery? Because a lot of the conversation around resilience is always very front-loaded in terms of what do we do if X event happens, whereas where something like the fellow over here mentioned in COVID, for example, that's left a very long-term impact on the educational outcome of disadvantaged children, yet, you know, all the reports I read say that the response to that recovery is then currently inadequate because we're not putting the investment in recovering, and that leaves us in a weaker position when something else happens. So I always think that when we talk about resilience, we don't think enough about recovery. So the question is, how do we plan to recover as well as how do we plan to endure?
Excellent. Thank you very much. We've got a guy, I think this is a crowdsourced question, it seems.
Hi, my name's Gregory Gillette, and I work in the Canadian government innovation field. I'd like to bounce off of what you were just saying, Anna, about a data management strategy. And Catherine, you mentioned SR21, and I know that a part of SR21 was to lay out a sort of metrics and performance measurement strategy alongside that spending review. And so I'm wondering, because when you look at that document, you see a whole list of metrics, many of which are not necessarily up to date, and there's no direct link to any of them. And so I'm wondering how you might think about improving that performance and data management approach within government and how that can facilitate more accountability with the public and with journalists.
Excellent. So data management in government to boost accountability. And no, you got to ask one in the morning. Here we go. Sorry, Martin.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Aoife Blanchard. I'm at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, which is a bit of a mouthful, and unsurprisingly, I'm interested in the kind of climate and energy system space. I'm really struck by some of the overlaps between the adaptation discussion, the infrastructure discussion earlier and resilience. And having just checked this risk register for 2023, the next biggest impact, high likelihood issue other than a pandemic is the failure of the national electricity system, i.e. the national grid. In a climate context, I think there's a huge opportunity as well as a challenge to modernize the grid. And I'd be quite interested to hear your thoughts, given the fact that with climate change it's likely to be at higher risk, but also we need to bring more renewables online. There are connecting issues. How do we make sure that the national grid is resilient for the future, is sustainable and is secure, and that we can reach our net zero targets by 2050? And whose responsibility is that? What can the government do?
Great question. Grid resilience. Could also have been in our infrastructure panel. We like to have things that cross disciplines here. So we've got resilience ex post recovery, we've got a data management strategy in government, and we've got grid resilience. Who wants to take?
So recovery, I think the really sad thing about the pandemic is that it exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. So lots of the people who perhaps were less secure in the labour market or were disadvantaged in education already were the people who suffered more. So I think it just it adds urgency to the need to deal with the inequalities that exist in our country, which have existed for a long time. And it calls for a combination of national programs, but also probably very localized support, whether it's within schools, within communities, within cities. Because, as you say, those were already very concerning inequalities. They're now worse for many people, and that is definitely not good for those people's resilience for the rest of their lives and into the labour market.
Thank you very much.
Shall I pick up Gregory's question about data in government, which is a brilliant question and something I'm very passionate about. And actually, this year in the civil service, we do this thing called One Big Thing, where the whole of the civil service focuses on one big thing, and this year it was data. So we have basically got data training across everything that the civil service does. We've got the wonderful CDDO, which is the kind of central function in the Cabinet Office that oversees strategy through to implementation. I think where it's really interesting to your point about, I suppose it's kind of so what, so how do you actually share that information to demonstrate the impact that you're really having? I think two things. One, we experimented with something called the Public Value Framework, which we launched in 2020, and the idea was that we would establish top-down the most important cross-cutting and strategic outcomes for the state, and then we would run the resource allocation process by those outcomes and then publish the metrics and our progress against those metrics pre-agreed on a transparent basis on an annual basis. And so we've had that in place for a few years. I think it needs another evolution, but I'm a really big fan of starting with outcomes, allocating resources, being clear about how you're using data. And then the second thing is evaluation. So we've got the wonderful evaluation task force in government, which we have turbocharged to make sure that we have evaluation strategies for pretty much everything that we do in government. So it comes back to this point about risk-taking. Like, how do you know if the risk was worth taking, whether you had the impact that you thought the policy or the programme was going to have, and what have we learned, and what's the cycle of evaluation that allows us to do better next time? And so I think the combination of kind of strategic, outcome-focused data management and resource allocation combined with evaluation is the thing that I really want to take to the next level.
Shall I say something about the grid? Okay,
Yeah,
which is, I'm not an engineer, so this is just a quick observation from having written about this. I'm a great fan of Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, which basically argues that resilient systems are those which have the ability to fracture into pieces and absorb blows without bringing down the entire system. And what that means in practice with a grid, electricity grid, is that ideally you want a grid which is able to transmit electricity generated in one place all the way to another place. So, for example, right now in America, although you've got all kinds of green energy being generated in one corner of the country, you can't physically get the grid connected in a way that will actually take it to where it's actually needed effectively. So that needs to happen. But in the process of actually integrating a grid and making sure that you can transmit electricity from one end to the other, you also need to ensure that if a shock happens to the system, be it a cyber attack or a weather-related shock or anything else, the system can actually fragment quickly into self-standing units. And what that means in practice is having local grids or even having local generators and systems like that as backups. And the latter point really matters. And, you know, in a place like America where there's a lot of constant focus on disasters and hurricanes, and where you had adverts up in New York City telling everybody all the time they have to have enough stuff in their basement or cupboards to survive a shock. Everyone's told they have to have flashlights and matches and food and water and money and all that to survive a shock all the time. That culture of being able to fragment quickly into self-standing pieces is very, very important indeed. And if you look at what's say happening in Ukraine today, one of the reasons they've managed to keep the lights on for such a long time is because there's been so much local adaptation and the ability for individual localized groups to find ways of keeping bits of the grid going, even if the wider grid is under attack.
Thank you very much. I think we have time. If this side of the room, I feel I've neglected you. Do we have any questions here? Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. Isabel from the British Academy. And I just wanted to pick up on something that I think has already been addressed to some extent in what you were saying, Anna. But crises often create, reinforce, and exacerbate inequality. And I just wanted to really channel a question in terms of how do our institutions and also how do our local communities, how do we create resilience that includes marginalised voices, that addresses the really direct needs that those marginalised groups may have, because if you are marginalised, you are much less likely to be resilient. So I just wanted to pick up on that. And I think it relates quite closely to some of the infrastructure discussion which happened earlier. Do you have the infrastructure to be resilient? Thank you.
Excellent. I think we'll take that, because I need to leave time for final comments. So we'll take this and then move to final comments.
Sure, so I think that's a great point. And I suppose there's different elements to it. So part of it, to build resilience in marginalised communities, it's definitely about knowledge and skills. So there's that whole set of issues. I mean, we know that generally more skilled people are more resilient to economic shocks. We know that more skilled people generally have been more resilient to technological change. Of course, we still don't quite know how AI is going to pan out, replacing some more high-skilled jobs too. But in general, skills are so fundamental to our ability to be resilient, and also to understand change, to understand the support that's available to us from government, whether it's local government or national government schemes. There are lots of support schemes for individuals, for businesses, and people don't always know about them, and often skills can be a barrier to that. But of course, more generally, how do we ensure people have infrastructure? Another thing that came to mind was digital infrastructure, where we know that some kids weren't able to do online learning to the same quality as others who had digital infrastructure at home. And then there's all the health, so all the health benefits from being in a place with cleaner air. And actually, we know that people with respiratory conditions went into the pandemic more at risk in certain ways. People with more green space were able to make more of their free time in the pandemic, enjoying that free space, whereas people in cramped inner city locations didn't have that luxury. So there are so many inequalities that were exposed by that experience. And again, I would come back to what I said before. Some of the things we know we need to do anyway to address inequalities, other things were particularly exposed in that situation. It's specifically, we need to make sure there's an adequate digital infrastructure. That's important in general for productivity, for work prospects, for having the skills of the future. And other things would be more specific to particular communities. One of the discussions recently about net zero is, there's a lot of national level frameworks we need to be in place, but loads of those projects and the delivery of those projects will be in places. And particularly if we have planning concerns or communities objecting to things, there is this real need to take communities along the journey to understand why things are important, to understand how areas can share in some of the benefits of the development and perhaps be compensated for some of the costs. But a clear example of that would be take clean air policies and the debate perhaps around ULEZ in London, which then actually had an outsized impact on the national debate on net zero, even though it's more of a congestion and clean air policy. If people don't necessarily fully understand some of the dangers of pollution to them, to their kids, health, educational outcomes, all these things being shown in the literature, then it's harder to get people on board with that program, and then that can really actually impact broader imperatives that we have as a society.
Yeah, I mean, the air quality issue is one that's very close to my heart. There's a lot of the research that we do. And I agree, it's incredibly difficult to get communities where they face 100 other immediate crises to think about this as well, and to think about the trade-offs, the economic trade-offs that might be involved. Did anybody else want to come in on inequality and resilience? Or should I? Perfect. In that case, I will move to our closing remarks, because we've only got a few minutes left. Kat?
I'll be brief. I think you've all added to my to-do list in my new job. I've got a lot of implementation to do. But look, what a really rich discussion. I think the key thing for me is there's a bit of a sequencing in what we've discussed today. So I think it's very, very hard without personal and community resilience to deliver some of the things that we've talked about. And so I think that has to be a big priority for all of us. And in particular, I think, focusing on solutions, focusing on innovation, harnessing technology and AI, and all of the tools that we've got to really drive productivity is going to be very, very critical. But most importantly, let's focus on the solutions and let's innovate as we tackle some of these challenges, and let's be open and honest about the trade-offs.
I would say two quick things. Firstly, that Andy Haldane, the former chief economist at the Bank of England, put out a really interesting paper after the great financial crisis saying that the banking sector looked like an Amazon forest. And by that he meant that all from the outside, it looked really strong and resilient and very impressive. But when you got close to it, you realized that all the trees had basically grown in exactly the same way and pursued the same niche. And they were kind of identical, they weren't diversified. And so just like in an Amazon forest, if you get some kind of fungi that hits one tree, suddenly they all die. What happened in 2008 was that all the banks had sort of done the same thing. And once when one trade went wrong, they all went down. And actually the system wasn't resilient as a whole. And I take away from that two things. First of all, that having diversity in any system is key to creating resilience. If you just have a uni-system, it won't be resilient if a shock happens. And that's, I think, the point that isn't often appreciated. But secondly, if you think about how companies and governments structure their lives these days, we live in a world where there's so much pressure to constantly streamline and be efficient that it's very tempting for each of us and each department or company to kind of do the same thing in order to be efficient and streamlined. And being resilient isn't just about having a diversity of people and approaches in a system. It's also about people having just enough slack to imagine what might go wrong, or to explore alternatives, or to create buffers, or create that little bit of spare capacity in the system that ensures that you can actually survive a shock. And defending that slack is incredibly hard in a world where everyone's under pressure to be efficient all the time. As Kat will know. Kat actually has to live with that in a practical basis. I just write about it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Hannah.
Okay, so final thoughts on the question, what do our institutions need to do? Well, I think this is obviously difficult. There's no easy solutions here. But we have a lot of good structures in place. It's just making sure they're fit for purpose given the new challenges we face and some of the pre-existing, long-standing challenges. Trying to differentiate between some of the sources of change that we can predict, at least to some extent, and others where there's a lot of uncertainty, you know, the shape of a future pandemic, etc. And then it's more about what are the general principles that we can consider important to have in place for resilience. And I would argue things like agility, data, to enable targeting, to enable understanding of how things are evolving are all really important. And I really like the 4 I's as well as kind of organizational principles too. But I think, yeah, so there's about the remits of the institutions, the coordination between them, and ensuring that the information that we have is also fit for purpose and timely.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, it's been a complete pleasure of mine to chair this panel and to do so here in Cambridge. We're over 800 years old, so I think Cambridge knows something about resilience, but we're also, I think, quite agile. The Bennett is a perfect example of that. So if you could please join me in thanking our speakers.